This is Patrick Russell. I'm interviewing Cynthia Christensen for the first time. This interview is taking place in Mitchell, South Dakota on July 16th, 2021. And this interview is being conducted by the Making History Project. So good afternoon, Cynthia, how are you?
I'm doing just fine.
All right. And could you tell me when you were born?
I was born November 29th of 1954
And where were you born?
in Brookings, South Dakota.
Okay, and tell me a little bit about your hometown when you were growing up.
Brookings is a college town, a lot different than it is today. Nobody locked their doors. Everybody knew what everybody's kids were doing, so you couldn't get away with anything. But you were pretty much free to do whatever you wanted to do.
And what college is there?
South Dakota State University.
Right. And how big was your family growing up?
I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
All right. Big family.
Mm-hmm.
And what did your parents do?
My dad is a plumber. He's 92 years old today, and he's still a plumber. And my mother did daycare.
All right. And did you graduate from high school?
Graduated from Brookings High School in
Okay.
'72.
All right. And in high school, did you have any hobbies or sports?
I decided to graduate from high school a year early, so I only went to high school for 3 years. So I spent a lot of time just condensing my courses and studying. And I worked in a grocery store besides.
Okay, so you were very motivated and busy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And what did you do after high school?
After high school, I got married, and I joined the Air Force in 1973.
Which happened first?
I got married.
Okay. And then you joined the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
And what made you want to join the Air Force?
Well, that was in the time of the draft, and my brother was being drafted. So I researched all of his opportunities and came up with, Dan, you need to join the Air Force. And I convinced him that it was the best thing for him, but while I did that, I think I convinced myself as well.
Okay. And, well, you were not going to be drafted, right, at the time?
I was not.
Okay. But you decided that by doing all that homework for your brother, it looked like a kind of cool thing to do.
It looked like a good deal. I wanted to go to college, wasn't sure how I was going to get the money to do that, and I found a way to do it.
All right. And what about the Air Force convinced you of that?
I think it was the GI Bill.
Okay. And, all right, so you enlisted in the Air Force, and where did you go for your basic training?
Went to Lackland Air Force Base.
All right, and what was basic training like for you?
It's pretty much what I expected it to be. It was a lot of physical activity, but they did a lot of teaching as well. One thing I found interesting was in my job in the Air Force, I had to carry an M16. They never taught me how to shoot it.
Okay.
When the guys would break off and do their M16 training, the female component got training on how to put your makeup on.
Really?
I found that really interesting.
How many females were in your basic training at that time?
I don't remember. Several.
But could you count them on one hand?
No. There were maybe around 100.
Okay, so it was a big group.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so you never got any training with guns?
My weapon, no.
And did you ever ask why?
I didn't.
Okay. But they gave you training specifically for makeup?
They did.
Really? And what did they teach you to do with makeup?
I don't remember.
All right.
I think I was 18 at the time.
Okay. What else do you recall about your basic training?
remember when I enlisted, I talked to the recruiter and told him the job I wanted was I wanted to work in a hospital. Didn't specify doing what. My real intent was to be a nurse. I took their test, and I tested real high in electronics. And so while I was in basic training, my orders came down to go to tech school, and I was going to become a missile mechanic. So I knew that wasn't in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably what I remember the most, was my disappointment at I'm not going to the hospital.
Okay. So missile mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so did you then start training to be a missile mechanic?
I got orders to go to Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado, and I was the first female air-to-air missile mechanic in the Air Force.
Okay. And what type of missiles are these?
I trained on several different missiles, Sidewinders being one, and they're still used today. But the missiles I ended up working on were Falcons, and they're obsolete today.
And what would you do as a mechanic for missiles? What type of work?
Every missile had a date that it had to be inspected by. And the missile shops had a big console that we put the missiles onto the console and tested to make sure that if it were needed, all the components would work. So my job was not only doing that, but taking care of the console to make sure the console was functional.
Okay. So testing, there really isn't too much repair of missiles, is there? You use them, right?
Right.
All right, so a lot of testing. So I imagine you must have had to take a lot of electronics courses.
I did.
Okay. And what else did you do in your training besides the electronics? Anything else?
That was pretty much it.
Okay. And so you're doing missile, well, you're a mechanic for missiles. What else do you do within the Air Force?
At that time, we frequently had drills, and we'd be called to deliver our missiles to the flight line. So my job was to actually drive the vehicle that pulled the missiles. We got the missiles over there, took them out of their cases, and helped put them onto the aircraft.
Okay. How often would you do that?
Oh, maybe once a month.
All right. And did you ever do anything else besides doing the missile mechanic
No.
work?
No.
Okay. So, and how long were you in the military for?
At that time, I was in for 2 years,
Okay.
and then got out and used my GI Bill to go to school.
All right. So for 2 years, you were a missile mechanic at the Air Force, testing missiles, sometimes loading them. And you got out. Then you went to school. All right. Where did you go?
I had 4 children before I went to school.
Okay.
Then I went to school at South Dakota State University,
All right. And you studied what?
nursing.
Nursing. All right. So then you got your degree.
I got my BS in
All
nursing.
right. And then what did you do?
I worked as a nurse in Denver, Colorado, and then I ended up moving back to South Dakota and worked as the director of nursing in Flandreau, South Dakota. And then I decided I really enjoyed the military life, so I joined the Air Force again as a nurse.
So okay. And what year was that?
That was in 1997.
All right. So if you first don't succeed, try again. So you wanted to be a nurse the first time, and they told you to be a missile mechanic.
Oh, hold on a minute. Before I joined the Air Force, a friend of mine convinced me to join the Army Reserve.
Hmm.
So I did that for, I believe, 5 years.
Okay.
from 92 to 97. In 97, I decided, no, if I'm going to do the military, I'm going to do it full-time.
Okay.
So that's when I went back into the Air Force as a nurse.
Now your husband is in the military, right?
Marty is my second husband.
Okay.
So I met him when I joined the Army Reserve.
Okay. And at that point, then you started traveling around a lot, right?
A little bit.
Okay.
A little bit, not so much.
All right. And so now you're in the second time. Now you're as a nurse. And tell me a little bit about that. How was that going?
Well, I joined the Army Reserve as a nurse. And my unit was based in Omaha, Nebraska. But they allowed us to drill in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So the VA allowed us to drill there. And we basically just did our nursing jobs. We took care of patients and did all the reports, the evaluation reports on each other. Oh, the physical therapy stuff that we had to do. And then I joined the regular Air Force. And they sent me to Lackland Air Force Base as a nurse, and I worked on a cardiac unit. I did that for 3 years. From there, I went to Omaha, Nebraska. They were contracting all of their GI procedures out to the civilian world, and decided that I could set up their GI program at their hospital. Had no experience in GI things.
GI is
Gastrointestinal.
Okay.
So I set up a program to do colonoscopies and upper scopes. When I first went to the surgical clinic, all of the surgeons, there were 3, each one of them told me they'd never had a nurse in their clinic and they didn't see a reason to have one. So that was very welcoming. But I got their program set up. Well, then I ended up deploying from that clinic. And when I left, it was, oh no, we're losing our nurse, we'll have to close. Well, I took one of the surgeons with me, and that helped alleviate some of their problems. And I think it was because of the deployment that I did while I was at Offutt, the Air Force offered me the opportunity to go back and get my master's degree. So my next assignment was back to South Dakota State University, got my master's in nursing, and then they sent me to Minot, North Dakota.
Well, before you go there, you said you were deployed. Where did you deploy to?
I went to Saudi.
Okay.
in
What year was that?
That was in 97, I believe. I think so.
Okay.
96 or 97. It's when Saddam was moving troops back to the Kuwaiti border. They sent us there to, it was, I think, Operation Northern Watch. Then I went to school, went up to Minot, and finished my commitment to the Air Force there. And then I was married to Marty, and he convinced me to join his Army Reserve unit again. And I got to go to Iraq with him.
Okay. So you've gone Air Force, Army, Air Force, Army. Okay. All right. So now you're in the reserves. All right. And did you happen to work in the same outfit as your husband?
I did.
Okay. So that made it good.
It did.
All right. So when you go back to the Army Reserve, tell me a little bit about the work you did there before you deployed to Iraq.
I joined his hospital unit in Omaha, but he was asked to move over to the COSCOM and work directly for the general. His agreement was if I could be moved also, he would go. So they moved both of us.
Seems like he has some pull with the
He
general.
So the whole purpose of us going to the COSCOM, we knew at that time that we were going to deploy to Iraq. So it was all preparation for our unit to go to Iraq. And then we finally deployed. So my job over in Iraq was I developed a tracking system. So every soldier that got injured and transferred to the hospital and eventually to Landstuhl and back to the States, I followed them and kept the general aware of what was going on with them. I also traveled around Iraq and helped teach advanced cardiac life support.
To who?
To doctors and nurses in the field.
So, but military,
Military.
U.S. military.
Mhm.
Okay.
I also helped teach the combat lifesaver courses. We were in charge of supplies in Iraq. So most of the people we taught there were people that were the truck drivers and supply people.
The convoys.
Mhm.
And did you enjoy teaching?
I did.
And what about the work with the, well, let's go back to the tracker. So that's a lot of, I imagine, a lot of people to keep track of.
It was. I went to Landstuhl and talked to the commander there, and I worked real close. I had a liaison there. So that helped me a lot to keep track and make sure everything was accurate.
And what was the magic system that you developed to keep track of all these soldiers?
It was basically just a spreadsheet.
And how would so you would know where they were on your base, and then they get transferred somewhere. Who's updating that spreadsheet, and how?
I am because I would call Landstuhl. I also had the manifest for who was on what plane. Usually they dropped off at Landstuhl because most soldiers came back into the war zone from Landstuhl. But if the injury was significant enough and they had to come back to the States, the general wanted to know what was going on with them after that too. So I followed, and I was able to call back to all the hospitals.
And what did the general do with this information?
She wrote letters to the families, and she called the families. And she kept their commanders involved in what was going on.
What was the name of the general?
General Rebecca Halstead.
And you worked pretty close with General Halstead?
Yes.
Okay. Was there any difference between your deployment in Saudi Arabia and your deployment in Iraq?
It was a total difference. In Saudi Arabia, I worked as a nurse. I was in charge of the hospital there. Before we went to Saudi, we had to reconfigure the whole hospital because the Air Force's package was set up to have a large hospital, and we didn't need such a big hospital. So before we left, the nurses that were going went in and figured out how many bandages did we need to take, how many IV pumps, all of that.
Okay, and then compared to what was the situation in Iraq then?
Iraq was more medical planning and being involved on the general staff.
Right. And what would be, from your deployment in Iraq, what would be your most memorable moment?
I think probably being able to be there with my husband. It provided each of us a person to talk to about what was going on. other people in our unit would talk about, my wife will never understand when I get home. We didn't have that because we were both there. We experienced things a little bit differently. But being together, I think, was easier than staying at home and wondering what was going on. You know, is he safe? What's he doing today? I knew all of that.
Mm-hmm. And that's not a common thing.
No.
And at this time, how is the ratio of women in the service in Iraq?
Definitely there were more men. Our unit was different because it was a headquarters unit. I would say there was maybe 10% women.
Your second, well actually this would be your fourth go around. Did you learn how to fire that rifle yet?
Well, when I became a nurse, I became an officer, so I no longer had to do the M16. I then had a 9mm pistol, and yeah, I went to training every year.
Okay.
And the M16, the guys that I worked with in the missile shop took me aside and helped me out with that.
Okay. But that wasn't official.
That was not official.
Okay. And did you receive any awards or medals for your service?
I received meritorious service medals from both the Air Force and Army. The Air Force Expeditionary Medal, achievement medals, commendation medals. I don't remember what else.
And how much would you interact with your husband in terms of the day-to-day work?
Probably about 90% of the time.
Okay. So, I believe he mentioned that he did a lot of training, right? And so
He did.
you also, that was part of your thing too.
Right,
And you were probably implementing the training.
right.
Okay. And did you have any scary moments in Iraq on the base?
It was really scary when we first got there and the mortars would come in because I didn't know what to expect. You kind of got used to it, if you can. I guess you just knew the drill and how to protect yourself better. My husband mentioned one of the times we were flying into Fallujah and being shot at. That was kind of scary.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the patients, we did get involved directly with some of the patients, and those people were seriously injured, and that was scary to me, to think that they were there by themselves.
And how often would you be dealing with patients directly?
I dealt with them directly maybe only once a month.
And it was a particular type of a patient?
The one that comes to mind that still kind of haunts me is a gentleman that lost both of his eyes. He just didn't have anybody. So I just went and sat with him until arrangements were made to transfer him back. And he had such a good attitude. It just amazed me.
And did you have a particular specialty as a nurse in terms of dealing with particular types of patients?
No, I did a little bit of everything.
Okay. And this patient that lost his eyes, like, You said he had a good attitude. If you can remember, what were some of the things that you spoke about?
We talked about when he got back home that he was going to need a lot of rehab work, and he probably would qualify for a seeing eye dog. And he said, you know, sometimes life just throws things at you. You don't know it's coming. You just have to learn to deal with it, and I'll be okay. I think he was better than I was with it.
Well, do you remember where he was from?
California.
Was he a young guy?
He actually had retired from the Army and volunteered to come back in. I think that bothered me also, just because he had the opportunity to be done and he volunteered to come back, and his whole life changed. We also, while I was there, the bird flu was a thing then. And the bird flu looked like it was, well, it was in Iraq. It hadn't started going from birds to, or from people to people yet. But we had to develop a plan. If it does do that, how is the military going to work this? And I was directly involved in planning that. And that was kind of scary.
Yeah, on the base,
Mm-hmm.
having that on leash. Did you get out much from outside of the base, or that was not permitted?
We left the base quite a bit to do training. I never went in a convoy. It was always via helicopter or a Sherpa plane.
And you're geared up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what type of training would you be doing when you go out?
Mostly training combat lifesavers.
And take me just through briefly, like what that training would involve.
Teaching them, if somebody is, say, blown up with an IED, teaching them how to assess that patient, what needs to be done first. If they're bleeding, obviously you got to stop the bleeding. So we taught them how to put tourniquets on. We taught them how to apply direct pressure. If they had a pneumothorax, their lungs were collapsed, we gave each of them a long needle and taught them where to place the needle in the chest to expand that lung again. We taught them how to start IVs and when to start IVs to keep people hydrated. Taught them how to put airways in people so they can continue to breathe. It was a good class.
And you're not training everybody. You're picking, like, if there's a platoon, you pick so many people out of each platoon, and they are the
commanders actually decided who was going to go to the class. So, like I say, mostly we trained truck drivers, people on the convoys. It was the convoys that were getting hit the most.
And did you ever have to use these skills yourself in Iraq?
I did not.
And on base there's a hospital, right?
There is.
Okay. And would you do rounds in the hospital?
I didn't. The only time I went to the hospital is if somebody basically needed somebody to sit with them and help make plans to get them sent home again. I worked with a young man, probably 20 years old, that emotionally, mentally couldn't handle being in Iraq. I spent a lot of time working with him, trying to get him to be able to stay. But he ended up having to go back home too. And so I inherited his job along with mine.
What job was his?
He was our enlisted technician. So he was basically our gopher.
All right, so this is somebody you were working with that was in your own unit, so to speak.
Mhm.
Okay, so it wasn't out in the field.
No,
And he was having difficulty just being in Iraq.
just I think being away from home.
And you expressed that earlier, that was a big deal.
It was.
I think your husband also mentioned that as well.
Mhm.
And is that your impression that for most soldiers that's perhaps maybe the primary issue is being away from family and home, that separation?
I think that's one of the issues. I think a lot of it depends on what they personally experience, because depending on jobs and where you're at the time, everybody has different experiences. You talked earlier about the mental health aspect. They really didn't have good provisions for people that needed mental health counseling in the field. The units were expected to take care of those people. And
What
that-
units?
If you belong to if you belong to the headquarters unit and somebody needed mental health counseling, there weren't a lot of people there to provide that. That person that needed counseling might be assigned to me so that I would watch them and help them and take care of them until they were better. I may or may not have any prior training on how to handle that. I always felt bad for the units, like an infantry unit would have to try to help their fellow soldier get through something. Nobody had the training, but that's just the way it was.
So there weren't any dedicated people to attach to units to help with that?
Very few.
And what about when they would leave the Army or Air Force?
You know, the VA has a very good PTSD program. But the military has always had a stigma about if you use those kind of services, you may not get promoted into a position that you really want. And so I think that prevents a lot of people from self-reporting that they need help. I don't know. I know they're trying to change that. I'm not so sure that it has.
What about those that are exiting the Army and don't have to worry about promotions anymore?
I'm not sure they self-report either. It's mental health is a different animal. Even though it's part of our physical makeup, people I think see themselves as weak if they have to report a mental illness.
But there's no hesitancy to report a sprained ankle.
Right,
Isn't that a paradox?
right. And I think a lot of people think they can work through it themselves. I'll get through this.
And were you ever deployed where you were in a combat mission?
Well, both of my deployments to Saudi and Iraq were considered combat missions.
But what about like individual missions within?
No,
Okay. You were in the headquarters then.
right.
And Did you bring anything back home with you in terms of any type of trauma, seeing the things that you saw?
Just hard of hearing
Okay.
and ringing in my ears. And I think that was from the exposure to, we had a mortar that exploded just a few feet from where we were. And I think that's when all of that happened.
And psychologically?
I'm still bothered by some of the people that I witnessed go through what they went through.
That would be the young soldier who lost his eyes.
Sure.
Yeah.
The good thing for me is I can talk to my husband about it. He was there and he understood what I was going through then and still today.
And so I guess the point is even though you're not directly in combat, there still are residual effects. And so when your deployment in Iraq ended, then what did you do?
Basically retired.
Okay. So you retired, so this would be for the 4th time. Is it for you? Is there a 5th in your career? You're not going back, right?
I'm not going back.
Okay. And so what did you end up doing then after your military career?
I taught nursing school here in Mitchell at Dakota Wesleyan. And I helped my husband a lot with his VFW projects.
Okay. And what do you do specifically with the VFW?
Help him do a lot of fundraisers. I take minutes for their meetings. Help him, he's the treasurer, so I basically inherited that job too.
Okay.
As far as putting the data into the computer. And I do a lot for our church.
Okay. And are you still teaching or?
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not.
All right. So now you're dedicated to service.
Yes.
All right. Good. In terms of your experience in the military, is there anything you would like to add that I didn't ask? Any kind of a memorable story or snippet of anything?
I don't think so.
You were the first female air-to-air missile technician
I was.
ever.
I was.
Wow. All right. In terms, you have a female perspective. Is there anything that you would share on that in terms of being in a male-dominated military?
I think it's changed a lot from when I first went in. When I first went into the Air Force, the guys weren't used to having a female in the missile shop either. I remember one of the questions they asked me when I first came in is, what would you like to see in the missile shop? Well, I'd like to see you shut the bathroom door. And I'd like a lock on that door. That was difficult for them to get used to. Eventually we got another female technician, and she portrayed herself more as one of the guys. And so it was very obvious they treated me differently than they treated her. But they also couldn't talk to her about female things, so they would come to me to talk to her about different things. When I first went to the missile shop, they decided one of my jobs would be, you'll have to come in early and make coffee and keep the office clean. Well, I was the lowest ranking person. And I said, I can do that, but when the next lowest ranking person comes in, that's no longer my job, right? Well, that's not really how they saw it, but that's how it turned out. Later, when I went back into the military, I went in as a nurse, and nursing is predominantly female. So I don't know if things changed in looking at women in the military, or if it's because I was in a predominantly female environment. But it was totally different.
Did you engage with any female combat soldiers?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Did you notice any difference in them, or whether it was their personalities or their experiences compared to the male-dominated military?
I think they talked more freely about being away from their families, and especially if they had children at home.
More so than the men.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else that you can think of?
I can't think of.
And being the first female air-to-air missile tech, is there anything that you would like to tell future generations about your experience, or what to do, or words of advice?
You know, I think people just need to be aware that whatever their situation is, they're not alone. Somebody has already experienced what they've experienced, and somebody's available to talk to.
On that note, since you were the first one, who did you lean on in that missile shop?
I lived in the barracks with an air traffic controller, and she was my go-to person.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else
No, I
missed?
think that covers it.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much, Cynthia, for your service. You're 4 times.
You're very welcome.
And thank you so much for sitting down and speaking with me today.
Thank you.
All right.
Oops,
Mm-hmm.